Have you ever met a woman who seems perfectly content spending days at home, not because she's lonely, not because she's afraid of people, but because the outside world simply feels too loud? People often misunderstand her. They call her antisocial. They say she's wasting her life. They assume she's shy, depressed, or incapable of handling reality. But what if the truth is almost the complete opposite? What if staying at home isn't an escape? What if it's protection? Because there is a kind of woman whose greatest battle is invisible. She walks into a crowded room, and before anyone speaks to her, she already feels something is wrong. Someone smiles while hiding resentment. Someone laughs while carrying grief. Someone says, "I'm fine," yet every instinct inside her whispers, "No, you're not." She notices the tension no one else notices. She hears emotion hidden beneath ordinary words. She absorbs atmospheres the way dry soil absorbs rain. And after enough years of living like this, silence begins to feel safer than society. Home becomes more than a place. It becomes a nervous system reset. Most people think empathy simply means being kind. But neuroscience tells a far more fascinating story. Researchers studying emotional contagion have found that human beings unconsciously mirror one another's emotional states. Long before we consciously interpret another person's facial expression, our brains begin reacting to subtle emotional signals. We are constantly influencing each other's internal worlds without realizing it. Now imagine someone whose sensitivity to those signals is exceptionally high, whether because of personality, upbringing, temperament, or life experiences. Some people appear especially responsive to emotional environments. They don't merely notice stress around them, they feel affected by it. For them, entering a room full of conflict can feel less like watching a storm and more like standing directly inside it. This is why the stereotype of the homebody often misses something important. To an outsider, staying home looks passive. Inside the mind of a highly sensitive, empathic person, however, it can feel like finally taking off heavy armor. Imagine carrying invisible weights every time you interact with people. No one else can see them. No one else believes they're there. Yet by evening, your mind feels exhausted, your chest feels tight, and your thoughts no longer belong entirely to you. Eventually, you stop asking, "Why am I so tired?" Instead, you begin asking, "Why do I only feel like myself when I'm alone?" That question changes everything, because once someone experiences the deep relief of emotional quiet, ordinary social life begins to feel strangely expensive. Not financially. Psychologically, every conversation has a cost. Every emotionally unstable person leaves residue. Every argument echoes long after everyone else has forgotten it. Over time, home stops feeling like isolation. It starts feeling like recovery. Carl Jung once suggested that much of human suffering comes from living too far away from the authentic self. Whether or not one agrees with every aspect of his psychology, his insight points towards something timeless. Many people spend enormous energy adapting to the expectations of others. For someone deeply empathic, that adaptation can become almost automatic. She becomes the listener, the comforter, the emotional translator, the one who notices everyone else's pain before they notice her own. People admire her kindness. Few recognize its hidden cost, because every time she comforts someone, she quietly sets aside a piece of herself. Not forever. Just long enough that eventually she can't remember where she ended and everyone else began. This is where the story becomes unexpectedly complicated. Many people assume that if someone enjoys being alone, they must dislike people. But that's often not what is happening at all. In fact, many highly empathic individuals genuinely love people. They simply struggle with prolonged exposure to emotional intensity. Think about standing beside a speaker at a concert. The music may be beautiful, but if it's loud enough for long enough, even the greatest song becomes exhausting. Human emotions work in much the same way. Joy can energize, grief can inspire compassion, love can heal. But constant emotional input, especially when it's unpredictable, can overwhelm anyone, particularly those who are naturally more sensitive to it. There is another misunderstanding that quietly shapes how these women are judged. Society often celebrates constant activity, busy schedules, packed calendars, networking, endless social interaction. The person who is always out is seen as successful. The person who chooses solitude is often asked, "What's wrong?" Almost never, "What have you discovered?" Yet history repeatedly reminds us that some of humanity's deepest insights were born in silence. Not because silence contains magical answers, but because noise often prevents us from hearing the questions. For someone who processes emotions deeply, solitude can become a laboratory. It's where confusing feelings begin separating into recognizable patterns. It's where borrowed emotions slowly dissolve. It's where intuition grows louder than public opinion. But here's the paradox. The more peaceful home becomes, the harder it can feel to leave. Not because of fear, not because of weakness, because the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine spending hours in crystal clear water, then suddenly being dropped into muddy waves. The difference shocks your senses. Crowded spaces begin feeling heavier than they once did. Small talk feels strangely draining. Conflict feels physically uncomfortable. Loud personalities dominate your attention, whether you want them to or not. You begin wondering whether you've changed or whether you've simply started noticing what was always there. Psychologists sometimes distinguish between solitude chosen freely and isolation imposed by circumstance. The difference matters. Chosen solitude can be restorative. Forced isolation, by contrast, often brings loneliness and distress. Understanding that distinction helps explain why two people may spend the same amount of time alone, yet have completely different emotional experiences. For the empathic woman who intentionally retreats to recharge, home is not necessarily a prison. It is often a sanctuary, and sanctuaries serve a purpose. But every sanctuary also hides a question. At what point does protection quietly become avoidance? Because there is a line so subtle that almost no one notices crossing it. At first, she stays home because the world is overwhelming. Then she realizes she feels calmer there. Then she begins declining invitations, then postponing difficult conversations, then delaying opportunities. Little by little, safety expands until it quietly replaces possibility. And the frightening part is that it never feels dangerous while it's happening. It feels comfortable, it feels rational, it even feels wise, which raises a question that changes everything. What if the very place that heals an empath can, over time, become the place that keeps her from discovering who she could still become? She doesn't notice it at first. Very few people ever do, because the most powerful psychological shifts rarely arrive with dramatic announcements. They happen quietly, hidden inside habits that seem completely reasonable. One evening she turns down an invitation because she's genuinely exhausted. The next week, she says no again because work has been stressful. A month later, staying home simply feels easier. Nothing appears wrong. In fact, life may even feel more peaceful than before. But the human brain has an extraordinary ability to confuse familiarity with safety. The more often we choose a particular response, the more automatic it becomes. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. Behaviors that once required conscious thought eventually become default settings. That principle helps us learn languages, master instruments, and develop healthy routines. It also explains how invisible prisons are built, not from iron bars, but from repeated comfort. This is why avoidance is so deceptive. It doesn't usually feel like fear. It feels like wisdom. It whispers, "You've had a long week. You deserve some peace. You can always go next time." Sometimes those thoughts are completely true. Sometimes they quietly become excuses that no longer protect your well-being. They simply protect your comfort. The difference between the two is one of the hardest things to recognize, because both sound almost identical. Imagine standing on the shoreline. Each wave reaches your feet, then retreats. If you stay there long enough, the tide slowly changes without you noticing. Avoidance works the same way. You don't wake up one morning disconnected from the world. You simply drift there, one quiet decision at a time. Yet here's the twist that most conversations about empathy completely miss. Not every woman who loves staying home is avoiding life. Some are finally creating the conditions necessary to hear themselves. Think about how often modern life demands performance. At work, you're expected to appear confident. With friends, you're expected to be entertaining. Online, you're expected to appear happy. Within families, you're expected to meet invisible expectations that were never clearly explained. Over time, many people become experts at reading everyone else while forgetting how to read themselves. This is especially challenging for people who naturally prioritize others' emotions. When your attention is constantly directed outward, your inner voice grows quieter, not because it disappears, because it keeps getting interrupted. Home, in its healthiest form, removes many of those interruptions. The silence isn't empty, it's revealing. For the first time all day, there are no expressions to interpret, no moods to manage, no hidden meanings hiding beneath ordinary conversations. Just space, and something remarkable often happens inside that space. Feelings that were buried beneath constant stimulation finally rise to the surface. Grief you didn't know you were carrying, dreams you abandoned years ago, resentment you politely swallowed, questions you've postponed for so long they no longer sound like questions. Viktor Frankl observed that between stimulus and response lies a space, and within that space is our freedom to choose. Whether in moments of suffering or ordinary life, that inner space is where self-awareness begins. For someone who rarely experiences genuine quiet, that space can be difficult to find. For someone who intentionally creates it, it can become transformative. But transformation isn't always comfortable, because silence has a peculiar habit. At first, it relaxes you. Then it confronts you. Many people believe they fear loneliness. In reality, they often fear what loneliness reveals: the unresolved conversation with themselves, the career they've outgrown, the relationship they've emotionally left but physically remain inside, the identity they've been performing for years. An empath sitting alone at home may suddenly realize that the exhaustion she blamed on work was never really about work. It was about constantly becoming whoever everyone else needed her to be. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as emotional labor, the effort involved in regulating emotions, expressing care, and responding appropriately to others. While everyone performs emotional labor to some extent, some people carry far more of it than they realize. They're the ones who notice when someone feels excluded, who smooth over awkward conversations, who sense tension before anyone mentions it, who remember birthdays, who absorb disappointment without showing it, who instinctively become emotional anchors for everyone around them. The world praises these qualities. It rarely asks what they cost. Imagine carrying a backpack. Every person you comfort places one small stone inside. No single stone feels heavy. You hardly notice the first 10 or 20 or 50. Years later, you're struggling to stand upright, wondering why your shoulders ache. Empathy often works exactly like that. It's rarely one overwhelming event. It's thousands of tiny emotional responsibility accumulated over time. Eventually, staying home doesn't feel like hiding. It feels like finally setting the backpack down. But here's the psychological paradox. If you never pick it up again, your muscles begin to weaken. The goal isn't to carry everyone's burdens forever, nor is it to avoid all emotional weight. It's to learn which burdens are actually yours. That distinction changes everything, because highly empathic people frequently confuse compassion with responsibility. If someone is sad, they feel responsible. If someone is angry, they feel responsible. If someone is disappointed, they somehow feel responsible. But compassion does not require ownership. You can witness another person's pain without becoming its permanent home. That lesson sounds simple. Living it can take decades. There is a story often told in psychology workshops. A therapist fills a glass with water and asks, "How heavy is this?" People offer different answers. 300, half a kilogram. The therapist smiles. The exact weight doesn't matter. What matters is how long I hold it. Hold it for a minute. It's manageable. Hold it for an hour. Your arm begins to ache. Hold it all day. The pain becomes unbearable. Emotions work much the same way. Empaths often don't struggle because they feel deeply. They struggle because they keep holding feelings that were never meant to stay. A stranger's disappointment, a friend's anxiety, a parent's expectations, a partner's frustration. Eventually, their own emotional landscape becomes so crowded they can no longer tell which feelings belong to whom. That is why solitude can feel so cleansing. Not because it magically solves problems, because it gives the nervous system enough quiet to begin sorting them. One feeling at a time, one memory at a time, one truth at a time, yet the nervous system has another fascinating characteristic. It adapts. If chaos becomes normal, calm can initially feel uncomfortable. But the opposite is also true. When deep calm becomes your everyday experience, even ordinary social environments may begin to feel surprisingly intense. A bustling cafe suddenly seems louder than it once did. A family gathering feels emotionally crowded. A casual disagreement lingers in your mind for hours after everyone else has forgotten it. You begin wondering whether you're becoming more sensitive or simply more aware. The answer may be both. Awareness often reveals what constant distraction once concealed, and that realization leads to an even deeper question. If staying home has helped you reconnect with yourself, how do you return to the world without losing yourself all over again? Because that is where the real psychological challenge begins. Not in learning to enjoy solitude, but in discovering how to carry its peace with you when you finally step back outside. And the answer starts with one invisible boundary that most empathic people were never taught to build. The strange thing about boundaries is that most people imagine them as walls, cold, rigid, defensive. They picture someone crossing their arms, saying no with a hard expression, creating distance between themselves and everyone else. But healthy psychological boundaries are almost the opposite. They aren't walls that keep people out. They're filters that help you decide what deserves to come in. Think about your home for a moment. You probably lock the front door at night. Not because you hate humanity. Not because you're afraid of every person who walks down the street. You lock it because your home is valuable. Your peace has value. Your safety has value. No one questions that decision. Yet many empathic women leave the emotional front door of their minds wide open. Anyone can walk in. A stranger's anger, a friend's panic, a relative's criticism, a coworker's stress, a partner's disappointment. Without realizing it, they become emotional hosts to feelings they never invited. After years of living this way, something subtle begins to happen. They stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and instead ask, "Why do I feel everything?" The answer is surprisingly simple, because they've never learned the difference between sensing an emotion and adopting it. Psychologists often describe empathy as the ability to understand and resonate with another person's emotional experience. But empathy isn't the same as emotional fusion. Healthy empathy allows connection while preserving a clear sense of self. Emotional fusion, on the other hand, blurs that distinction until another person's emotional state begins to dictate your own. Imagine watching someone caught in a powerful river. Compassion motivates you to help. Fusion convinces you that the only way to help is to jump into the current without a rope. Now there are two people struggling instead of one. This is why the strongest helpers are not always the ones who feel the most. They are often the ones who remain grounded enough to be useful. Airline safety instructions contain a lesson that extends far beyond airplanes. Put on your own oxygen mask before assisting someone else. It sounds selfish until you remember that an unconscious helper cannot rescue anyone. The same principle applies emotionally. If every conversation leaves you depleted, if every relationship requires you to abandon yourself, if every conflict steals your inner peace, eventually there will be very little of you left to give. Many women who identify as highly empathic carry an invisible belief they learned years earlier. If I don't help, I'm a bad person. Sometimes that belief develops in childhood. A child notices tension between adults and becomes the peacemaker. She learns that harmony depends on her. She becomes unusually aware of other people's moods because doing so once helped her feel safe. Over time, that adaptation becomes part of her identity. As an adult, she enters every room already scanning for emotional weather, not because she consciously chooses to, because her nervous system learned that paying attention kept her protected. The adaptation was intelligent. But adaptations that help us survive childhood don't always help us thrive in adulthood. This is one of Carl Jung's most enduring insights. Parts of our personality often form as responses to life's demands. They protect us, but if we never examine them, they can quietly begin directing our lives long after the original danger has disappeared. The empathic woman who feels responsible for everyone's emotions may not actually be responding to today's situation. She may be responding to yesterday's, to experiences that taught her love had to be earned. That peace had to be maintained. That conflict had to be prevented. The present becomes colored by the past without her even realizing it. This is why awareness matters so much, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. Have you ever driven home and suddenly realized you don't remember the last several minutes of the journey? Your body knew the route so well that your conscious attention wandered elsewhere. Much of our emotional life works in exactly the same way. Automatic, predictable, invisible, until something interrupts the pattern. Sometimes that interruption is heartbreak, sometimes burnout, sometimes a period of unexpected solitude, and sometimes it's the quiet realization that you spent years carrying emotions that never truly belonged to you. That realization can feel both liberating and frightening. Liberating because you finally understand why you've always felt exhausted. Frightening because if you've built your identity around taking care of everyone else, who are you when you stop? Identity is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. We often think of it as something we discover. In reality, much of it is something we repeatedly practice. If every day you become the listener, you begin believing you exist to listen. If every day you become the rescuer, you begin believing your worth depends on rescuing. If every day you become emotionally available to everyone except yourself, you begin forgetting that your own emotions deserve attention too. Robert Greene has written extensively about the masks people wear in social life. While his perspective comes from strategy rather than clinical psychology, it echoes an important observation. People often become trapped by roles they never consciously chose. The dependable one, the strong one, the understanding one, the endlessly patient one. These identities earn admiration. They also create expectations. And expectations have a curious way of becoming cages. Imagine an actress who plays the same character for 20 years. Eventually, audiences stop seeing the actress. They only see the role. Now imagine forgetting that you're acting. Many empathic women experience something remarkably similar. Others know them as calm, supportive, gentle, understanding. Few people realize that beneath those qualities may lie someone who is profoundly tired. Not tired of loving people, tired of disappearing inside that love. There is another misconception worth challenging. People often assume that emotional strength means feeling less. But neuroscience suggests something different. Emotional regulation isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about experiencing them without becoming controlled by them. Picture the ocean during a storm. The surface is violent. Waves crash in every direction. Yet thousands of feet below, the water remains astonishingly calm. The emotions haven't disappeared. They simply don't dominate every level of the system. That is emotional maturity, not becoming emotionless, becoming deeper than the emotion. For the empath who loves staying home, this distinction is life-changing. The goal isn't to become less sensitive. Sensitivity can be a remarkable gift. It fuels compassion, creativity, intuition, deep relationships. The challenge is learning to keep sensitivity from turning into self-erasure. And that requires one practice that feels surprisingly uncomfortable at first. Disappointing people, not through cruelty, not through indifference, but through honesty. There comes a moment when someone asks for more of your time, more of your energy, more of your emotional space. And the kindest answer you can truthfully give is no. That single word often feels unbearable to someone who has spent a lifetime keeping everyone comfortable. The heartbeat quickens. Guilt appears almost instantly. The mind begins inventing explanations. Maybe I should just help one more time. They'll think I'm selfish. I don't want to hurt them. But guilt is not always evidence that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's evidence that you're breaking an old pattern. And old patterns rarely disappear quietly. They protest. They whisper. They bargain. They promise that if you just go back to the way things were, everyone will be happier. The question is, will you? Or will you finally choose a different path? Because the answer to that question determines whether your home remains a sanctuary that restores your spirit or becomes the place where you gather the strength to build a life that no longer requires you to hide from the world. And that transformation begins with one unexpected realization about loneliness, a realization that overturns everything most people believe about being alone. People often say that the opposite of loneliness is companionship. It sounds reasonable. It even sounds comforting. But it isn't entirely true. The opposite of loneliness is not simply being surrounded by people. It is being deeply connected. First with yourself and then with others. There are people who spend every evening at parties and still feel profoundly alone. There are others who sit quietly by a window with a book, a cup of tea, and their own thoughts, and feel completely at peace. The difference isn't the number of people in the room. It's the quality of the relationship they have with themselves. This is where the journey of the empath quietly changes direction. In the beginning, home was a place to escape. Then it became a place to recover. But eventually, if healing truly takes place, home becomes something else entirely. It becomes a place where you remember who you are. And once you remember who you are, the world no longer feels like something you have to survive. It becomes something you can participate in without losing yourself. That shift is subtle. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in countless ordinary moments. The first time you leave a conversation without carrying someone else's guilt home with you. The first time you listen without trying to fix. The first time you recognize another person's disappointment and allow it to remain theirs. The first time you say, I understand how you feel, instead of silently deciding it's your responsibility to make everything better. These moments seem insignificant, but psychology tells us something remarkable about small changes. Our identities are not transformed by one grand decision. They are reshaped by repeated evidence. Each healthy choice becomes proof. Proof that you can care without absorbing. Proof that you can love without disappearing. Proof that you can be compassionate without sacrificing your own peace. Over time, your brain begins constructing a new story. Not, I exist to carry everyone, but I exist to live fully. And compassion is one part of that life. That single change in identity alters everything. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence emphasizes that self-awareness is the foundation upon which emotional regulation, empathy, and healthy relationships are built. Without recognizing our own internal state, even our best intentions can become reactive instead of intentional. Many people think empathy begins with understanding others. In reality, sustainable empathy begins with understanding yourself. Because if you cannot distinguish your emotions from someone else's, how can you respond wisely? You cannot navigate a map if every road looks the same. Self-awareness creates emotional clarity, and emotional clarity creates freedom. Imagine standing in a forest during heavy fog. Every direction appears uncertain. Every tree looks identical. Then slowly the fog begins to lift. The forest hasn't changed. Your ability to see it has. Life feels very much the same. Healing doesn't remove difficult people from the world. It changes how clearly you recognize them. It doesn't eliminate conflict. It helps you decide which conflicts deserve your energy. It doesn't make everyone understand your boundaries. It teaches you that they don't have to. One of the greatest misconceptions about boundaries is that everyone will appreciate them. Many won't. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries may feel uncomfortable when you begin protecting them. Some may call you distant. Others may say you've changed. They're right. You have changed. Not because you've become colder, because you've become clearer. Clarity can feel unfamiliar to people who were accustomed to unlimited access to your emotional world. But clarity is not cruelty. It is honesty, and honesty is one of the deepest forms of respect for yourself and for others. Consider a tree in the middle of a forest. Its roots reach deep into the earth. Storms come, seasons change, branches bend, leaves fall. Yet the tree remains because its strength comes from below the surface. Empathic people often spend so much time extending branches toward others that they forget to deepen their own roots. They become available to everyone, grounded by no one. Home, at its best, is where those roots grow. Not because walls possess magical healing power, but because quiet gives you the opportunity to notice what constant noise hides. Your fears, your dreams, your values, your limits, your voice, and perhaps most importantly, your own company. There is an old philosophical idea that every person eventually encounters two versions of solitude. The first feels empty, the second feels full. The first asks, why is no one here? The second asks, what can I become while I'm here? That question transforms solitude from absence into possibility. For the empathic woman, this distinction matters deeply. If staying at home is driven entirely by fear, then the walls slowly become smaller. The world begins shrinking. Possibilities fade. Curiosity weakens. Life becomes predictable, safe, but painfully narrow. If staying at home is used as intentional restoration, something very different happens. Peace becomes portable. You no longer need perfect silence to remain calm. You no longer need everyone else's approval to feel secure. You no longer believe every emotional storm belongs to you. Instead, you carry your center with you into conversations, into relationships, into crowded places, into uncertain season, because your sense of peace no longer depends on where you are. It depends on who you have become. There is a beautiful paradox hidden inside empathy. The more securely rooted you are in yourself, the more genuinely available you become to others, not because you give more, but because what you give is no longer fueled by obligation. It's fueled by choice. And there is tremendous freedom in choosing when to listen, choosing when to rest, choosing when to help, choosing when to walk away, choosing when silence is wiser than explanation, choosing when love requires presence and when love requires distance. This is emotional maturity, not perfection, not endless kindness, not constant self-sacrifice. Simply the wisdom to know that your heart was never designed to become a storage place for everyone else's pain. It was designed to connect, to feel, to inspire, to create, to love, and then to return home, not merely to a physical house, but to the quiet place within yourself where your own thoughts, values, and emotions still belong to you. Maybe that's the greatest misunderstanding about women who love staying at home. People see the closed door and assume they're hiding from life. Sometimes they're not hiding at all. Sometimes they're rebuilding. They're untangling years of borrowed emotions. They're learning the sound of their own intuition after decades of listening only to everyone else. They're discovering that peace is not the absence of people. It's the absence of internal chaos. And once that peace becomes real, something unexpected happens. The world stops looking like an overwhelming place filled with emotional demands. It begins looking like a place filled with meaningful choices. They step outside not because they have to prove anything, not because society expects it, not because they suddenly become someone else. They step outside because they finally know that no matter where they go, they can always return to themselves. That is the quiet strength of a healthy empath. Not that she feels everything, but that she has learned which feelings to hold and which to gently let pass. If this story made you see yourself or someone you care about in a new light, keep exploring these ideas. The better we understand our own minds, the more compassion we can offer others without losing ourselves. And sometimes one new insight is all it takes to begin living with a little more clarity, a little more peace, and a little more freedom.